Welcome back to Washington Watch. I'm Tony Perkins, your host. Glad to have you along. The website, tonyperkins.com. If you're on Twitter or Parler, it's at @TPerkins. All right, I'm continuing this conversation. I think it's important. I continue to know a lot of folks in law enforcement. It's just an important part of our communities. And this call to defund law enforcement, I'm telling you, it's having a demoralizing effect upon police officers across the country, and we're seeing it. Retirements, people are leaving early. As we were just discussing, good people are choosing other vocations. It's not good. And the outcome here, I think, is going to be disastrous. But there's more behind this agenda with Black Lives Matter, as we were talking about. Not only is it about the police, tearing down statues, and then, of course, there are others that are coming underneath of this to advance what I would say is a Marxist agenda. Well, joining me now to talk more about this and kind of give us a historical perspective of some of those who have actually been targeted by these protesters is Frederick. I want to talk about Frederick Douglass, but I want to bring in Dean Nelson to talk about that. Dean is a senior fellow here at the Family Research Council for African American Affairs, and actually also head up the Frederick Douglass Association. So, Dean, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Great to be back with you, Tony.
Very quickly, I want to get on to Frederick Douglass because I don't think a lot of people understand the importance of Frederick Douglass. But first, the Black Lives Matter and this whole agenda, and it's way beyond just the black community, but when they're calling for the defunding of the police and they're calling for the tearing down of statues and different things, is that reflective of the entire African American community in America?
By no means is it, and certainly not the kind of community that I grew up in, growing up in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. We were taught to respect authority. We were taught to affirm the traditional values growing up in the African American church. We always understood that there was racism, and there'll always be that. That's the human condition. Yeah. But I think that it's a huge mistake to ascribe Black Lives Matter as a movement, and certainly the organization that represents much of the black community. Certainly not all of the black community.
One of the statues that has been targeted, Frederick Douglass, and you wrote a piece about Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. This is tragic, quite frankly, that Frederick Douglass would be one of those individuals targeted.
Absolutely amazing. I talked to one of our chapter presidents in Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass lived and where he gave that famous speech on 4th of July. Actually gave it on the 5th. First to find out, was this true? It just did not make any sense to me that anybody would do this. And he affirmed, in fact, it was true that they had dismantled and destroyed part of that statue. But you're right, Frederick Douglass gave that historic speech in Rochester, which was it was hard medicine. It was very strong to our nation because in the time he gave it, 1852, we had slavery, although New York did not, but much of America did have slavery. But the thing that I tried to point out in the piece was, even though he came really hard and challenged America to live up to its founding principles, two things that he also did. One, he emphasized that the Constitution was a pro-liberty document, not a pro-slavery document. And then secondly, he ended his message with hope that America would one day live up to its founding principles, which, of course, after the Civil War, it did.
Why would his statue be targeted? Is it just ignorance to our history and who these figures are?
You know, when I talk to our group up there, they're working with law enforcement trying to find out. They haven't, to my knowledge, found out who did it. We can't prescribe. I don't know if it was Black Lives Matter activists. I don't know if it was a random thing. We don't know who it was. But for certain, much of America, even the black America, has forgotten about who Frederick Douglass really was. When I mentioned that famous speech, if you were to go online virtually anywhere, it'll be hard for you to find a full quote in context. They want to take pieces of Frederick Douglass's statement to fit their narrative and to fit their agenda, rather than presenting the message of Frederick Douglass in terms of what he really did. Much like Martin Luther King Jr., he called for justice, but at the same time, one of my favorite quotes from Frederick Douglass basically is quoting Proverbs, where he says that, righteousness exalts a nation, sin is a reproach to any people. He says that's the whole of my politics, the positive and the negative of my politics. And I think that we must know who the person was in full to really appreciate the work that he did.
Well, Dean Nelson, isn't that an argument for the case of protecting the statues, the good, the bad, and the ugly? I mean, knowing our history, number one, they're no perfect people, but knowing that history gives us a chance to chart a course forward that moves us toward that better nation.
I think that those statues that exist to help remind us of our past. And I certainly understand that there are arguments as to why some statues should be removed and placed in other places. But the reality is that we cannot forget our history, even the painful parts of our history.
Right. But we should also have the conversations and not just randomly, lawlessly tear down statues.
Without a doubt, Frederick Douglass would never advocate the destruction of property or the taking of innocent life. He was one who emphasized protest, but doing it in a peaceful way, much like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 100 years later.
All right, Dean Nelson, thanks so much. Folks, don't go away. We're coming back with more on today's Supreme Court decisions after this.